Creativity is not a function of some freakish genetic wiring that occurs in the brains of a few people. It is instead the function of awakening and exploiting the natural creative energy we all possess. The human brain is a naturally creative instrument. We have this sort of wrong notion of what is creativity. We have these romantic notions that creativity involves being spontaneous and free and natural, and that to be creative, if it requires so much work and effort, that kind of spoils the effect. But this is not only wrong in a general way, it's also wrong scientifically, because that's not how the human brain works. Our culture has all of these myths and misconceptions about this form of power. We think of it's a function of genetics, or high IQ, or a larger brain, or going to a great university like Oxford. Essentially, the human brain is a dual processing system. Information comes into the brain, and it is designed to compare and differentiate things that come in. We hear this sound, we associate it with this, or we contrast it with that, and that allows us to respond and be intelligent and rational with this material. That's the brain. It's a dual processing system. The more information that comes into the brain, the more you feed it with experiences, with study, with research, with practice, the more the brain can naturally make all of these associations and connections between this and that. If you were to look into the brain of a chess master or a great jazz artist or somebody who excels at a sport or anything like that, you would see in that brain all of these neural pathways that go off in a million different directions. It's like this rich ecosystem, and all of these different pathways can connect up. That is what true creativity is. What makes some people seemingly more creative and imaginative than others? Creative people are those who opt for career paths that mesh with their deepest interests and inclinations. They feel a deep personal need to discover something about the world, to solve a problem that perplexes them, to invent something that's simply not. Feeling personally engaged and motivated in their work, they focus more, they learn faster, they're more patient and persistent than other people. Think of creativity as the ultimate synthesis of the child and the adult within you. We carry both of these within us, the child being the remnant of our earliest years when we were more imaginative and exploratory and fluid. Now, normally we keep the adult and the child within us rigidly separated. We let the child out in our free time when we socialize or go to parties or watch a movie or play games or sports or go on vacation. This is also when our minds are freer, more fluid, maybe a little bit less productive, but they're freer and more fluid. The adult dominates our work world and our careers. This is also when our minds become a lot tighter as we try to fit into the narrow role of business person, engineer, writer of self-help books, etc. By keeping the adult and the child rigidly separated, we completely dry up any creative potential that we want to have. The goal is to find a way to distill and incorporate that playful, exploratory, fluid spirit of the child into our disciplined, experienced work. It is not that we alternate sometimes between the child here or the adult there, but that we fuse the two together into one inseparable whole, that whole being the creative individual. In my book, I call this mind that children possess original mind. It is marked by incredible fluidity and openness. But children do not create great works of art, and they do not invent significant pieces of technology, and they don't make discoveries about the world. And neither do we when we daydream or dream or make a joke or change the subject of a conversation. These are all examples of what I call low-level creativity, exhibiting the natural associating power of the human brain. But let us add to this natural associating power of the human brain something else. Years of study, practice, and experiment within a field. With all of this experience, a great deal of knowledge is stored in our long-term memory. With all of this accumulated knowledge and experience, the mind can roam about in this vastly expanded cognitive space, making all kinds of novel, insightful associations between ideas over here and ideas over there. What we call creativity is nothing more than the ability that some people cultivate to search wider, to imagine more possibilities, to imagine more connections, to associate what has never been associated before. It is a function of two critical elements. First, a great deal of knowledge that is stored and organized in our long-term memory. And second, the willingness and ability to roam freely through all of that knowledge. This second quality is what we might call fluidity of mind. We notice this fluidity if we've had a few drinks, or we take some drugs, or we smoke some pot, or we're feeling extremely tired. Suddenly, it seems as if doors are opened up and our minds can move about more freely and they can come upon ideas, interesting ideas that had eluded us before. Well, highly creative people do not need this extra bit of stimulation. They have managed to retain or rediscover that fluid original mind of the child and wedded it to all of this knowledge and experience, giving them what I call the dimensional mind, a mind capable of seeing more dimensions of the visible and invisible world around us. High-level creativity requires these two elements. If you have an open and fluid mind, but not enough knowledge and experience, you will basically remain on the level of a child. If you have a lot of knowledge and experience, but your mind is tight and unwilling to roam, you will come up with the same conventional responses. Well, highly creative people have both. They have the knowledge and the experience, plus the mental fluidity, which gives them the ability to see more possibilities in the world around them and to maximize, to realize to its fullest, the natural connecting power of the human brain. The great psychologist Carl Jung, he called this serious play, the combination of the playful exploratory spirit of the child with the serious tasks and experience of the adult. 4 simple exercises that I believe if you adopt somehow in your practice, they will slowly loosen up the mind and push it in this direction that I'm talking about of greater creative energy. These exercises are the following. Cultivate negative capability, think like an outsider, use active imagination, and finally, subvert your patterns of thinking. This first exercise, cultivate negative capability, is the most philosophical, and it basically involves an attitude, a way of looking at the world that will naturally loosen up the mind. The term negative capability comes from the great early 19th century poet and writer John Keats. Keats was struggling to understand what makes one person like a William Shakespeare so much more creative and imaginative than another. According to Keats, the Shakespeares of the world, the highly creative types, cultivate what he calls negative capability. They can negate the ego and its anxieties. They are not in a rush to come to a conclusion about the world or any new phenomenon. They are completely open to entertaining this idea or that idea at the same time while continuing to observe what's going on around them. They can look at ambiguous or contradictory evidence and not be disturbed or feel the need to explain them away. This ability to withstand what seems mysterious, to manage the lack of knowing something with certainty, is the primary quality of all creative people, no matter their profession. Because they feel less anxious and in need to rush to a conclusion, they consider more possibilities when confronted with a problem, which allows for greater possibilities, a greater range of connections and creative associations. Mozart possessed negative capability. He could look at two diametrically opposing forms of music at the same time and not feel anxious. He could explore them and try to synthesize the differences between them. In physics, at a very early age, at the age of 16, Albert Einstein was struck by the paradox in the following thought experiment. A man standing on Earth looking at a light beam in the sky, and another man theoretically moving at the speed of light alongside that light beam in the sky, that both people would see that light in exactly the same way, in exactly the same form. That is what Maxwell's law on the absolute speed of light necessitated. But how could it be so? Certainly, somebody moving at the speed of light would see that light before it could travel far enough to appear as light. In other words, he would see it as electromagnetic particles. Well, for 10 long, laborious years, Einstein thought only of this paradox and thought experiment, without straining for quick answers or simple conclusions, in a complete state of negative capability, considering every possibility until it finally bore fruit with his theory of the relativity in time and space, the special theory of relativity. What possessing negative capability will do for you is help you push past the impatience and the anxiety that make you come to conclusions too early on in the process. Here's how you could potentially adopt negative capability in your life. First, you practice it on a micro daily level. In your personal relationships, you counter the tendency that we all have to label and categorize the people that we encounter, the people around us. Your goal is to judge these people much less and to observe them more. People are infinitely complex, and they never fit into the little categories that we have of their behavior. Your goal is to move inside their perspective, to try to see the world from their point of view, to get a more nuanced and individualized sense of who they are. This will instantly make you less anxious, less judgmental, and more perceptive. Now you apply this to your work. Before you begin on a project, you know it's difficult, but you throw out as many assumptions as possible. It may be difficult, but you open yourself up to other possible theories, interpretations, the kinds of interpretations and theories that you never usually entertain. You speculate and think about the information in front of you, but you control that constant desire to rush to some sort of conclusion. Third and finally, you learn to embrace uncertainty and chaos. Life is inherently chaotic, and it doesn't fit into our tidy formulas. Not only does this not make you anxious, but you find chaos and uncertainty deeply exciting and stimulating. Slowly adopting this as an overall philosophy will naturally loosen the mind up and give it greater creative flow. You will naturally consider more options and possibilities. The second exercise, Think Like an Outsider, is related to a notable phenomenon in the history of creativity. Some of the most important discoveries, inventions, and innovations within a field come from people who are trained in a much different field and who have an outsider's approach. Albert Einstein was a complete outsider. His two most important discoveries came when he was working at the Swiss Patent Office. Google itself exemplifies this idea. It is perhaps the most successful business on the planet, founded by two men who are relatively complete outsiders to business and who therefore structured and directed their company in a very novel and creative fashion. I could go on and on and on with this list, including many great artists. There are two important reasons why outsiders generally have a creative advantage. First, they are less steeped in and burdened by the conventions of the field that they are attacking. They ask a different set of questions. They approach problems from unconventional angles. And second, they are often trained in totally unrelated fields and so can make interesting and creative connections between two very different forms of thinking. like science and business, or chemistry and medicine, or engineering and design. Now, we can't all consciously follow such a path, but even within the careers that we're pursuing, we can train ourselves to think like outsiders and help loosen up the mind in the process. To think like an outsider requires basically two things. It basically means to take advantage of any training that you have had in any unrelated field, which almost all of us have had. It also means to take advantage of the incredible explosion of information that we now all have access to, and to expand your searches on any project to seemingly unrelated fields. By applying what you know from a different field, and by using this expanded research, you will naturally absorb and use different patterns of thinking. This will make you ask a different set of questions before you begin your project. And asking a different set of questions is almost half of what it takes to be creative. The third exercise, use active imagination, is deceptively simple. Often what separates creative from conventional thinkers is that they simply search wider. They use their minds to generate possibilities that others don't think of, and then they work to verify what they came up with. Another great example is with Henry Ford. Early on in his career, in the earliest years of what would later become the Ford Motor Company, Ford was anxious to speed up the production of cars. He saw the automobile as the ultimate consumer product, but in order for it to become that, he had to greatly increase the production rate in his factory. So he spent a couple days looking at his employees on the factory floor and trying to imagine how he could get them to move faster from car to car. Suddenly one day he imagined something completely different. He imagined the men standing still and the cars coming to them. He didn't know what that really meant, but he decided to try it out, and lo and behold, it increased productivity by such an incredible exponential rate that it could now become the consumer product that he had envisioned. The difference between regular and active imagination is that the latter is used consciously to reach very, very practical results. It's not imagination for coming up with wild things. It's imagination used for very practical results. Think of active imagination as a kind of creative muscle that you're developing. First, within the loose constraints of what you're working on, you open your mind up you give it complete free rein. You entertain almost every possibility that you could imagine or visualize. You engage in what Charles Darwin calls fool's experiments. This is the fun, play part of serious play. You use notebooks, sketches, diagrams, models, prototypes to help externalize the products of your imagination. Once you have gone through this, you now enter the second serious part of the process. First, you choose one or few of the more promising possibilities that were generated by your imagination, and now you actively work to test, verify, or confirm it. The fourth and final exercise, maybe the most important in some ways, is called subverting your patterns of thinking. And it's based on the idea that our minds tend to fall into certain habits and patterns and grooves that severely limit what we consider as possible. Well, creative people have the ability to move against these patterns, to actively subvert them, and thereby expand what they consider. One pattern that we often fall into, and we're very rarely aware of it, is our tendency to always focus on the end result, the finished product, how to make that product as perfect and powerful as possible. We live in a goal-oriented culture. To see a contrast, we would have to look at Asian cultures, in which thinking about process and structure and how the parts relate to the whole are given much more emphasis and importance. In a goal-oriented culture, when there is a setback or a glitch, we naturally focus on the end result. So if, for instance, I'm writing a book and the book isn't coming out as I had imagined, I will think about the ideas and my style of writing and how I can improve these ideas and the communication of them to give the book more wallop, more effect. But often the source of the problem is the structure of the damn book, the organization of the chapters, how one idea is linked to another. So many books start off well but completely fall apart because of faulty structure. We can say the same thing about businesses. The problem is in how the products are produced, how the personnel in the company is structured and organized, the decision-making, the chain of command, etc. Napoleon Bonaparte effected the greatest revolution in military history by thinking deeply about the structure of his army and how to organize it so it could be faster and more fluid in the attack. Thinking about structure, process, organization, they're not natural to us, but in making ourselves do it, we will naturally expand what we consider giving ourselves more possible creative associations and connections. Another habit we fall into is our tendency to be mesmerized by patterns themselves, by trends, by paradigms, and how all the information that we're looking at somehow fits into these patterns and paradigms. Well, highly creative people have the ability to look at what doesn't fit into patterns, the anomalies that cannot be assimilated. Thinking about what is absent, what didn't happen, is a highly creative form of thinking. The most selfish people in the world are those who merely consume what other people have created in the past and don't contribute anything. So that's sort of my ultimate message to you all, and that's the end of my talk.